Hello again, my name is Dr. Ryan Galloway, and now I'm going to talk to you about answering critiques on the criminal justice reform topic. So, there will probably be a lot of critiques on this topic. I think it'll be a primary negative strategy. There are 5 of them I'm going to talk to you about today: the critique of abolition, the critique of Afro-pessimism, critical race theory critique, critical legal studies critique, and the Foucault critique. So, here we go. The abolition critique would say that prisons only make society's problems worse. It is an abolition of prisons movement. It's based on the writings of Angela Davis, who wrote a book called Are Prisons Obsolete? And her argument is that instead of keeping a bunch of people in prison, we ought to be using those resources to fund community initiatives, to do wealth redistribution initiatives, to make sure that we attack the problems of crime at the root cause and not just punish and incarcerate people who have committed a crime. Davis and others argue that legal reforms justify the prison industrial complex, that you make the prison industrial complex look good when the real solution is to rip it out from the root. Instead of justifying prisons, you need to get rid of them altogether. And we need to focus on societal alternatives which eliminate the motivations for crime in the first place. I anticipate this will be the most popular critique on the topic. The links are very good. The literature is very strong. There's a great deal of evidence on this critique. To answer the critique, you can start by saying that abolition is impractical. Even though there is a growing criminal justice movement in the United States, it's not going to be able to get rid of prisons. We're going to have prisons in some capacity, and we may as well make them more humane as we go along. That goes along with the second argument that abolition trades off with productive criminal justice reform. That when you tie the criminal justice reform movement to abolition, that people are turned off from that approach. That very few people actually think we ought to be getting rid of prisons wholesale. Even those that think we ought to be improving prisons don't think we should be getting rid of it altogether. The third is that the plan helps the goals of the abolition movement. Most affirmatives on this topic will be in the direction of what the abolition movement wants. They want less people in prison. They don't want the death penalty. They want less harsh policing practices, etc. And so the plan operates in the direction of the abolition movement, which sets up your last argument, which is your permutation. You want to do the plan and rethink prisons. You want to do the plan and advocate for abolishing prisons. So if you did something like drug legalization, you could say people shouldn't be in jail for drugs, nor should they be in jail for anything else. If you get rid of the death penalty, well, that's something that the abolition movement wants to do as well. And as long as you don't lock yourself into the idea that life without parole is your alternative to the death penalty, then you can say we ought to get rid of the death penalty and we ought to move in the direction of these societal reforms that you talk about. Next critique is Afro-pessimism. The argument is that society can never get better for black people. Probably the lead author in this vein is Frank Wilderson, who has written several books on this question. He's written Red, White, and Black, and the most recent one he's written is Afro-pessimism, which came out just this year. It argues that liberal reforms will only mask an unjust system, that the idea that we make a small patchwork gain for black people does not mean that we uproot the system of white supremacy which the United States is based upon. And we need an absolute overturning of the order of things. Sometimes it's called burn it down, sometimes it's called an unflinching paradigmatic analysis, but there are a lot of different alternatives to the Afro-pessimism critique that essentially say, as long as we stay in a white supremacist order, we will never make things better for black people. We need to overturn it altogether. We need revolution, not reform. To answer the critique, you can say that Afro-pessimism trades off with positive political action. Locking yourself into an entirely pessimistic vision means that you won't make progressive political change for black people. You'll also need to argue that anti-blackness is not ontological. It is not inherent. it can be changed, and you need to point to improvements in society over time. That things, while certainly not perfect for black people, are a lot better now than they were before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that we have made progress in improving rights for black people in the United States. The next thing you want to do is indict the alternative. There are specific indictments of the unflinching paradigmatic analysis alternative that say that revolutionaries need to flinch and that black people need to strategically flinch in order to challenge the system. And finally, you want to permute the critique. You want to argue that the plan can be done and make things better for black people while at the same time engaging in a revolutionary praxis to improve the system as a whole. Next argument is critical race theory, which certainly has some similarities with Afro-pessimism and with the abolition critique. But when I think of critical race theory, I mostly think of the works of Delgado, and I think of the works of Derek Bell, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. The law is embedded in white supremacy, and where I would draw the distinction between critical race theory and Afro-pessimism is critical race theory is more emphasis on the law itself, and that the law was created by white people, for white people, and that so-called neutral legal reforms, in fact, benefit white people. And one example of this that critical race theory authors use is they use the example of First Amendment law. They say that giving everyone the right to speak is racialized because if you give white people the ability to engage in hate speech, that allows them to silence the speech of minorities. Therefore, First Amendment law is definitely racialized, and it doesn't apply in the same situation for everyone. Legally neutral solutions will be used against minorities. I think that this is something that would be especially true against hard-on-crime affirmatives. So arguably, you could be more tough on crime. You could go after hate crimes with the affirmative, and there may be some affirmatives that choose to do that in the wake of recent events in the United States. But that historically, hate crimes legislation has in fact been used against minorities more than white people. Even if it was targeted against white people originally, it's not interpreted that way when you get to the legal system. And that radical reform of the law is necessary. We need to go to grassroots movements. We need to have opposition to the law. We need to overturn the law because the law is engaged in white supremacy. To answer the critique, you can argue that the law can help alleviate racism. You can point to the Civil Rights Act. You can point to affirmative action as things that have helped alleviate racism. You can argue that the alternative will fail. It will be rejected. That grassroots activism is not going to be effective. And similarly to your arguments against Afro-pessimism, you can argue that critical race theory derails progressive political change, that the movement places itself in opposition to ideas and laws that would be helpful for minorities. And last, of course, you want to permute the critique. There's good evidence that says combining legal activism and combining legal skills with grassroots movements help those movements to succeed and help make the world a better place. Critical legal studies is sort of the Marxist version of critical race theory. It actually predates critical race theory, and critical race theory splintered off from CLS, arguing that critical legal studies was too white. But critical legal studies argues that progress through the law is an illusion, that the law is designed to keep elites in power, that it's designed to keep the wealthy in power, and that is not only how the law is written, but it is how it is interpreted. A critical facet of the critical legal studies critique is to argue that the law is indeterminate, that it can be interpreted however one wishes. And CLS authors would argue that judges start with the decision they want to reach, and then they justify it by however means they can use it. They'll cite different precedents. They'll work around the law. They'll say that words mean things that they don't otherwise mean, and that you can make the law do whatever you want to do. And the law is not objective. The law is not interpreted by objective jurists, that the people that interpret the law are people who have been to law school and indoctrinated into the law school mindset. They've been to elite institutions, and as a result of that, where they come from makes them more likely to interpret the law in a manner that upholds elite interests. To answer the critique, you can say that the law is relatively determinate, that the CLS authors are right to some degree, that the law is not perfectly determinate, but pretty much you can determine what the law means if it's written well. It's difficult for me to say if the law banned the death penalty, that somehow justifying the death penalty in a given interest was consistent with that law. We've made big changes in the law before, and the law has been relatively determinate. You can also argue that the law is capable of progressive social change, that we've seen rights expand in the United States with the civil rights movement, with the women's rights movement, etc., and things can get better for the oppressed. You can also argue that the alternative is utopian. It's unclear what we should do with the law. It's unclear why rewriting the law would result in a better society and why it wouldn't still be interpreted in a manner that was elite interests. And of course, you want to argue for your permutation, which you can make pragmatic political change while arguing against the indeterminate and non-objective nature of the law. Finally, there's the Foucault critique. Juridical power is the power of the law, and Foucault's argument was that juridical power will be replaced by disciplinary power. So what do I mean by that? We get rid of legal control of people, but it gets shifted off to other elements of society. If you let people out of prison, they'll just be sent to halfway houses, they'll be sent to community service, they'll be put on parole, and they will be surveilled. And Foucault argues that when we come up with those alternatives will quickly be used to include more people under the disciplinary power than would have been considered to begin with. So people will be like, this community service is a really good idea. We ought to use it for people that we weren't going to even put in prison in the first place, that we weren't even going to put under any form of control. And that phenomenon is known as net widening in the criminological literature. Alternatives to incarceration will just expand disciplinary power, that people will be surveilled and controlled, and people will believe they're doing something wrong, and as a result of believing they're doing something wrong, will exercise self-control, and they'll be controlled even better than someone else forcing them to do something. In other words, someone's going to say, I am a deviant, I did bad things, I need to prevent myself from doing those bad things, which is far more control over an individual than just saying there's a law on the books that prevents you from doing what you want to do. And Foucault argues that we need to resist disciplinary power, and that's his usual alternative. Answering the critique, juridical power can constrain disciplinary power. Most affirmatives on this topic will give people more rights than they had before, and therefore, if they have individual rights that cannot be curtailed by community service officials, that cannot be curtailed by parole officers, etc., that the law can be used against the disciplines and help constrain power. You can permute the critique. You can get rid of your instance of juridical power while not expanding disciplinary power or resisting disciplinary power. You can also argue that Foucault's theories are flawed. I don't want to go too granular here, but one of the arguments against Foucault is that Foucault says power is everywhere and we're always wrapped up in power, and as a result of that, it becomes difficult to articulate an individual subject that's capable of resisting power if we're all embedded and enmeshed in power relations. Then you can also argue for pragmatic politics. We need to make things better when we can. We need to make the lives of people better, and we need to be less worried about our head in the clouds as to vague definitions of power and more what we can do on the ground. So in conclusion, there are 5 critiques. The abolition critique, which would say getting rid of prisons is a good idea and that your affirmative justifies the continuation of the prison industrial complex. There's Afro-pessimism, which argues that you won't make things better for black people and you will only spray paint the law and make the law look like it can be effective for black people, when in fact, black people will not be better off until we have a revolution against white supremacy. You can argue against critical race theory, which argues that the law is inherently white supremacist. The law was created by white people for white people, and so we shouldn't use the law in order to advance the interest of minorities. Critical legal studies argues that the law is indeterminate, that it is controlled and interpreted by elites, and we would be better off working around the law. And finally, Foucault argues that when you remove legal power, that you put in its place disciplinary power, which are non-legal forms of power that come in and actually control people better than they would otherwise be controlled by the law.